April 5th, 1242. The early morning was thick with cold and anticipation. Lake Peipus. It wasn't just a body of water, it was a pulsating artery dividing two worlds, Orthodox Rus' and Catholic Livonia. On this merciless, icy arena, an epic drama was about to unfold, a battle that would determine the fate of an entire civilization. Picture this. An icy, biting wind tears the last wisps of snow from the frozen surface. Thousands of warriors, both steel-clad knights from the west and resilient Russian warriors, will clash in an unyielding, deadly struggle. At any moment on this treacherously fragile expanse, steel will clang, hooves will thunder, cries of pain will echo, and a storm of arrows will tear through the frozen air. On one side are the formidable knights of the Livonian Order and the bishopric of Dorpat, an iron spearhead of Catholic Europe propelled by an insatiable drive for expansion. Their objective goes beyond mere territorial conquest. They aim to wipe out the Orthodox identity of Rus, already catastrophically weakened by the merciless Mongol invasion. On the other side stand the Rus warriors, exhausted but unbowed, led by one man whose name is destined to become legend. But it won't be brute force that wins here, nor sheer numbers, nor the weight of armor. Instead, victory will belong to a cunning intellect, a strategic genius capable of transforming the icy expanse into a deadly trap. This is the story of how one man, balancing on a knife's edge between the devastating Mongol threat from the east and relentless Western aggression, saved his land from complete annihilation. This is the story of the battle on the ice, a battle where tactics triumphed over numbers and will conquered steel. But to understand how Rus found itself on the brink of disaster and why this battle became inevitable, we need to turn back time to the origins of this brutal confrontation. It wasn't just a one-day battle on a frozen expanse. No. The battle on the ice was a brutal culmination, the explosive resolution of a long-standing, relentless war. A war for resources, for control over vital trade routes, and ultimately for the very right to exist, waged between two colossal civilizational poles, Orthodox Rus and the expansive Catholic West. Imagine a chess game where the fate of a continent is at stake. From the late 12th century, when German Crusader knights founded Riga and the Order of the Sword Brothers, and later the Livonian Order, the colonization of the Baltic lands proceeded relentlessly. Under the banner of crusades, blessed by the Pope, Western knights, Danes, Germans, and Teutons moved eastward, seeking to spread Catholicism and seize new lands. For them, this was not merely a religious mission, but a purely pragmatic grab for the primary resource, land with everything it contained. It was also about seizing control over the richest trade routes, such as the way from the Varangians to the Greeks, which passed directly through Russian lands. This economic war began long before 1242. As early as 1227, Pope Honorius III and later Gregory V issued unprecedented papal bulls, urging merchants across all of Europe to cease trade with northwestern Rus. The goal was clear: to deprive the Rus of metal for weapons, food, and ships, essentially anything that could sustain their resistance. This was a total economic blockade, designed to strangle Rus', rendering it defenseless against the impending aggression. And when disaster struck Rus' in the form of a devastating Mongol invasion, which shattered and weakened the principalities, Western neighbors saw their golden opportunity. They watched as the Mongols swept across Russian lands with fire and sword and decided it was time to claim their piece of the pie. The conflict, which had smoldered for years under the guise of papal bulls and economic sanctions, now erupted with new, deadly force, reaching its bloody climax on Lake Peipus. But to understand how Rus ended up on the brink of disaster and why this battle became inevitable, we need to rewind time, back to the origins of this brutal confrontation. The first half of the 13th century. For Rus, this was a time of catastrophe, an era of survival. Devastated by Mongol hordes who had swept across the land with fire and sword, leaving behind nothing but ruins and ash, Rus lay bleeding, seemingly defenseless against any new enemy. Western neighbors, the insatiable Livonian Order and the bishopric of Dorpat, with a predatory glint in their eyes, saw this colossal tragedy not as a threat, but as a prime opportunity for unprecedented expansion. This brutal Western power didn't emerge out of nowhere. In 1236, after a devastating defeat at Saul, where their Grand Master and dozens of knights fell, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were effectively destroyed. But the Roman Curia had no intention of abandoning its strategic foothold in the Baltics. Just the next year, its remnants were incorporated into the more powerful and ominous Teutonic order, forming its northern branch, the Livonian Landmeistership, or simply the Livonian Order. This was a well-oiled military machine aiming to colonize the Baltics and impose Catholicism with an iron fist. Pope Gregory IX, without hesitation, called for a new crusade, this time directly against the Orthodox schismatics, justifying the aggression with religious dogma. And that wasn't all. Remember the economic blockade? The Pope openly declared that he would curse anyone who dared to sell weapons, food, or even ships to the Rus, attempting to bleed them dry and disarm them before the inevitable invasion. So, on one side stood the Novgorod Republic, severely weakened but unbroken. A city renowned for its independent spirit and rich trade networks, it now desperately needed a strong leader capable of uniting its scattered forces. By a twist of fate, such a leader emerged in the young Prince Alexander Yaroslavich, later known as Nevsky. Meanwhile, on the other side stood a colossal unified power. This included the Livonian Order, the vengeful bishopric of Dorpat, led by Hermann von Buxhoeveden, and the heavy cavalry of Danish and German knights, whose steel armor and absolute confidence in their invincibility seemed unshakable. They were also joined by the local militia of the Estonians, whom the Russians called Chud. The stakes had never been higher. The Crusaders acted decisively and brazenly. In 1240, they captured the border fortress of Izborsk, then besieged Pskov and forced its surrender. This was a shocking blow, but their true intentions became crystal clear when the knights advanced further north and built a wooden fortress in the strategically vital Koporia Pogost, just a day's march from Novgorod. This was a direct challenge, an open declaration of war. Their goal was obvious: complete control over Novgorod, its vital trade routes, and ultimately the total subjugation of all northwestern Russian lands. The fate of Russia's western borders, its Orthodox faith, and its very culture hung by the thinnest of threads. How could a single prince, with his weakened yet proud army, hope to stop this unstoppable juggernaut? The answer lies in understanding his own system, his unique war machine. Alexander Nevsky's strength wasn't simply in his personal bravery or his mighty hand in battle. No, his true genius, his deadly war machine, was built upon a profound understanding of tactics, flawless logistics, and a keen understanding of enemy psychology. He was more than just a prince. He was a strategist, a politician, and a psychologist, all rolled into one, an astute and perceptive ruler who knew when to stand firm and when to compromise. His army, while it included a large militia of Novgorodians and Finno-Ugric tribes, possessed an unbreakable core in its princely retinue. These were professional, heavily armed warriors, essentially Russian knights. These fighters, including his brother Andrei Yaroslavich's detachment, which numbered about 1,000 men, were capable not only of fierce attacks, but also complex, well-drilled maneuvers. This was critically important against the iron wedge formation of the Crusaders. Alexander wasn't just gathering men under his banners. He meticulously chose the place and time for the decisive battle, cleverly utilizing the terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. His tactics were absolutely groundbreaking for that era. He deliberately placed his relatively weaker infantry in the center to absorb the first devastating blow of the Crusader pig formation. It was a devilish scheme, to let the initial impact pass, only to then snap shut the steel pincers. He heavily reinforced his flanks with his own cavalry retinue and that of his brother Andrei, and kept his best troops, his personal reserve, hidden until the very last moment, anticipating exactly how the battle would unfold. But war isn't just a bloody dance of swords. It's primarily about ruthless logistics. Alexander keenly understood that an army, no matter how brave, was doomed without supplies. His campaign into the Chudian lands after liberating Pskov wasn't merely an act of revenge or a show of force. It was a deeply calculated strategic operation. This was Zazhitye, a foraging expedition to gather food and fodder from the enemy populace, simultaneously replenishing Russian supplies and depriving their adversary. Even more crucially, this campaign was about finding the optimal and only possible route for his army to return to Novgorod. He needed to bypass the devastated lands to avoid the horrors of starvation and the loss of combat effectiveness. The prince knew that the path across the ice of Lake Peipus to the mouth of the Zhelcha River wasn't just a route, it was the army's only chance for survival. While the Knights of the Livonian Order relied on their time-tested yet agonizingly predictable pig formation, a massive, unwieldy wedge of heavy cavalry, Alexander knew how to turn their arrogance and tactical predictability into a deadly trap. Their discipline was ironclad, their fighting spirit fanatical, but their tactics were primitive and their logistics completely incapable of sustained operations in foreign lands without total plunder. They were like a powerful battering ram, but without flexibility or intelligence. This radical difference in their approaches to warfare and in their grasp of its underlying mechanics brought Alexander Nevsky to the shores of Lake Peipus. There, he had something truly unprecedented in store. With his forces assembled and the plan complete, it was time to step onto the battlefield, a place where ice would turn to blood and strategies would seal destinies. It's early morning, April 5th, 1242. It's not just cold. This is a biting, piercing frost that gnaws at your bones, making you shiver even under thick layers of clothing. You're standing on the vast, treacherously smooth surface of Lake Peipus. The icy surface, covered with wet snowdrifts and huge, sharp chunks of ice, stretches to the horizon, mercilessly reflecting the dull pre-dawn sky. Feel this cold, biting wind carrying the scent of lake water and impending slaughter. It cuts to the bone, but the tension in the air feels far more intense than any cold. It hums, it pulses, it electrifies every nerve. Slightly elevated on the eastern bank, above the snowy plain, a dense forest forms an unmoving, somber wall. This is more than just trees. It's camouflage. It's a hidden position, concealing Russian reserves, poised to erupt from their concealment at any moment. And now, to the west, they appear, the Knights, a relentless steel wedge they call the Pig. Thousands of armored warriors, certain of their invincible might, advance across the ice. Listen, this heavy, guttural rumble is the clang of steel, the ringing of swords, the creak of leather saddles, and the dull thud of hooves from their massive war horses treading heavily on the frozen surface. Every step sends a vibration through the ice, through the ground, and into your own feet. They advance relentlessly, their cross banners fluttering in the wind. Their fanatical confidence is almost palpable. They don't see the trap. Not yet. All they see is an open plain and the seemingly weak center of the Russian forces, which they intend to crush. But imagine that horrifying, instantaneous moment of realization when, having broken through the Russian center, their colossal wedge suddenly gets bogged down near the shore, when their massive war horses start sinking into wet snowdrifts and sharp shards of ice, losing their murderous momentum. When the flanks they thought they had defeated suddenly snap shut, and the knights, trapped in this icy snare, see themselves surrounded by a forest of Russian spears and the steel walls of Russian shields. Then a storm of arrows erupts, darkening the sky. This isn't just a battle, this is hell, and it's about to erupt on this fragile, icy surface. The calm before the storm was over. At dawn on April 5th, 1242, the battle on the ice began. True to his cunning plan, Alexander Nevsky placed his relatively weak infantry, mostly Novgorod militia and foot soldiers, in the center of his battle formation. It was an inviting gesture, a bait, but the flanks were strategically strengthened by his personal retinue and the heavy cavalry of his brother, Andrei Yaroslavich. However, his main trump card, the elite shock reserve of Suzdal heavy cavalry, was skillfully hidden on the wooded eastern shore of the lake, completely unseen by the enemy until the opportune moment. The first move. As Alexander expected, the famous pig formation of the Knights' Wedge, with a deep rumble and a furious battle cry, slammed into the center of the Russian forces. The Crusaders' steel battering ram smashed through the defense, sweeping aside the infantry. Picture that initial crushing impact, the clash of steel and flesh, the splintering of spears, the dull thud of swords, and screams of terror and pain. The knights, confident in their tactics, pushed relentlessly forward, believing victory was already theirs. But instead of the anticipated easy breakthrough and panicked retreat, the relentless wedge suddenly got stuck. It had slammed into a low, snow-covered, forested bank, thick with wet snowdrifts and huge chunks of ice. The deadly momentum was lost. The steel pig was no longer a battering ram, turning instead into an unwieldy, helpless mass. The knights, in their heavy armor and on their massive horses, were stuck, bogged down in this icy trap, unable to regroup or maneuver. Their pride and inertia became their greatest undoing. At this critical moment, with the enemy disoriented and immobilized, Alexander Nevsky gave the signal. His deadly reserve, the heavy Suzdal cavalry, erupted from their hidden position in the forest. They struck the flank of the bogged-down wedge with furious, irresistible force. Simultaneously, the Novgorod and Pskov forces, who had been holding the line until now, crashed into the enemy's weaker flanks, where the lightly armed Estonian militia and the soldiers of the Bishop of Dorpat were stationed. These were steel pincers, relentlessly closing. The Estonian militia, unable to withstand the double assault and seeing their supposedly invincible knightly masters bogged down and falling, wavered and fled. Their panicked retreat completely exposed the knights' rear, leaving them without protection. The central Crusader formation found itself in an absolute vice, surrounded on all sides, trapped between the Russian regiments, the icy shore, and their own mounting chaos. The clang of swords and the splitting of helmets filled the air. The lake churned beneath the combatants and groaned with the splintering of breaking spears and the ringing of cleaving swords. A merciless slaughter began. Some knights attempted to break through and escape across the ice, but the Russian warriors showed no mercy. They pursued the retreating enemy for 7 versts, a colossal distance across the frozen lake and along its shores, finishing off anyone who tried to get away. Blood stained the ice crimson, marking a dramatic, undisputed victory. The consequences of this colossal slaughter on the ice of Lake Peipus were inevitable and far-reaching. The consequences were immediate and seismic. The battle on the ice became a complete and decisive turning point. It delivered a powerful blow, halting the Livonian Order's unprecedented expansion eastward and permanently securing Russia's battered but unbroken western borders. It was a victory that changed the course of history. Politically, the Crusaders' defeat was humiliating. In that same year, 1242, the Livonians, utterly defeated and humbled, sent envoys to Novgorod to offer their submission. A peace treaty was signed, under which the order completely renounced all its ambitious territorial gains in Novgorodian lands. Furthermore, they were compelled to return the Pskov hostages, who were children of the nobility they had held captive. Pskov, a strategic fortress that had only recently trembled before the order's might, now firmly re-established itself within Novgorod's sphere of influence, restoring its strength. Fundamental changes took place on the map of Europe. The Narva River and Lake Peipus now formed a new, stable, and enduring border between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism. This frontier, forged in blood on the ice, would withstand decades of subsequent conflicts, defining the geopolitical landscape of the region. Militarily speaking, the victory was a clear triumph of Alexander Nevsky's tactical genius. He definitively proved that a sophisticated mind and innovative strategy could overcome a numerically superior and heavily armed foe, one relying on outdated, predictable methods. The deaths of hundreds of Germans, specifically 400 killed and 50 captured, with some accounts suggesting as many as 500 dead, alongside countless Estonians, dramatically shifted the balance of power in the Baltic. The Russian forces demonstrated they were not merely barbarians, but a formidable and adaptive force. For society and culture, this battle became a legend. With much of Russia's lying in ruins after the Mongol invasion, the battle on the ice became a spark of hope, a tremendous moral boost. It strengthened the spirit of the Russian people, showing that resistance was possible and victory achievable. Alexander Nevsky, defender of orthodoxy and savior of the Russian land, instantly became a national hero. His name was remembered in litanies in Novgorod churches until the 16th century. Then, centuries later, his image was revitalized and canonized, transforming into a symbol of resilience and defense of the homeland. This symbolism endures to this day, with a day of military glory of Russia established in his honor. This momentous victory was more than just fending off an attack. It ensured the survival of Russia's Orthodox identity and its very right to exist. But what profound lesson does this story hold for us today? The battle on the ice is much more than just a bloody page in a history textbook. It's a timeless lesson, etched into the very fabric of time, about how a true leader's strength lies not just in personal courage, but also in strategic thinking, incredible adaptability, and, most importantly, in the ability to unite a nation in the face of an absolute existential threat. Picture this: Rus lay in ruins, torn apart by the Mongol hordes, while from the west the relentless iron roller of Crusader Europe advanced. How was it possible to not only survive, but to triumph under such circumstances? Alexander Nevsky, a shrewd and insightful leader, demonstrated this. He masterfully balanced between the two most powerful, ruthless forces of his time, the devastating Mongol horde and the aggressive Western Crusaders. He knew when to stand firm and when to wisely compromise, all to preserve his statehood and culture, even when all odds seemed absolutely against him. His victory on Lake Peipus was more than just a tactical triumph. It was a victory of strategy over stagnation, of intellect over brute force. It proved that even in the darkest of times, when a nation is bled dry and seems utterly doomed, one person with exceptional vision and an unyielding will can change the course of history. The main lesson of the battle on the ice is harsh but true. Historical rights, even those consecrated by centuries and the deepest faith, only matter when they are undeniably backed by armed force. True victory is not merely a bloody defeat of the enemy on the battlefield. It is much more than that. It is the ability to secure peace, to protect one's interests for decades to come, and most importantly, to ensure the future of one's land, one's people, and one's culture. This is precisely what Alexander Nevsky accomplished on the ice of Lake Peipus, forever changing the destiny of Rus. His name and his feat became an unquenchable symbol, a beacon for all who believe in the unbroken spirit and unconquerable will of their people.